Well, good morning and welcome to City Church. Whether you're visiting us for the first time or a regular with us, a very happy Easter Sunday to you. I want to start by taking you on a journey back through time 500 years. So the year is 1520, and you and I live in a village. We're part of a rural community in which we work as farm labourers. It's also a time of war, and our whole region is under threat. We know an enemy is getting ready for battle, and this reality, well, it casts a shadow over everything. You can't escape it. It dominates our thinking and every conversation. It shapes our future. We simply don't know what tomorrow will bring or what the future will hold. And it unsettles our souls. Everywhere you go, there's an underlying fear, a sense of bewilderment, even sorrow. We don't know how to say to our kids when they ask, Daddy, should we be afraid? What should we say to them? And at the heart of our anxiety is the thoughts, how is this all going to end? It's even taking a toll on community life, impacting the village. We're becoming a little suspicious of people we don't know too well. How do we know they're not spies from the outside? And then we worry about our work. What will come of everything we've invested our lives in and worked so hard to achieve? The fear of war has a hold on us, on our very survival. But one thing we know is that the king, our king, has left his castle, taken an army into battle far away, and all we can do is wait for news. And then, one morning, we hear the sound of distant hoofbeats approaching. A rider enters the village. We jump out of bed and into the street, and before a watching crowd, the herald announces the battle is won. The war is over. The king has defeated our enemies, and as a result, we're safe. That announcement, that piece of good news, had nothing much to do with you or me. It all happened a long way off, and yet it's changed everything about our lives. And our immediate response, well, it's a mix of joy and relief that pushes out the fear. Tears of joy replace tears of sorrow. Burden has been lifted from our back, and right now we have a new future. We run, we tell our kids, we hug them, tell them that they're safe, and the whole community comes together again. Silly suspicions, they're replaced by joyful hospitality, and it changes our attitude even to work as we can start to build for the future, and not just our future, but our children and our children's children. Well, why do I start with this story? I start with this story because I think it shows just how one piece of good news can change our world and give us a real and lasting hope. And of course, that's what the whole world is looking for right now. I mean, just imagine if you could turn on the TV for a corona update and the news that they led with was this: ladies and gentlemen, we would like to announce that we've successfully trialed a vaccine for coronavirus, which will now be available for everyone to receive. Well, talk about a game changer. Immediately life can start to return to normal. A virus that had dominated our lives for so long, well, it's now no longer our enemy. A virus that had the power to shut down the economy, lock down a third of the world's population, its power is broken in an instant. Well, I'm encouraged to hear that an Oxford University team say they're 80% confident of a vaccine by September. Let's hope and pray that that may happen. That would be good news for the world, wouldn't it? But I want to suggest, well, it wouldn't actually be the best news we could receive today. What do I mean? Well, C.S. Lewis, one-time professor at Oxford University, when he was facing a national emergency in his own time, argued that the world lies in the grip of a more significant epidemic. Lewis understood the threat that lay behind the invention in his day of the atomic bomb. So for the first time in history, many people, perhaps an entire city, could be wiped out in a single strike. But frightening as that was, Lewis said something that I think may surprise many of us. He said this: do not let us begin by exaggerating the novelty of our situation. Please believe me, dear sir or madam, you and all whom you love were already sentenced to death before the atomic bomb was invented. Lewis's point is stark, but obvious when you stop to think about it. Corona, well, right now it's focusing our minds on the tragedy of death. But actually, around the world every day, before the coronavirus was ever around, 250,000 people die. And for us to have a lasting hope, what we need is not a cure just for corona, but a vaccine against death itself. Coronavirus is just the latest messenger, someone has said, to deliver the message that death is the problem. A corona lockdown is doing the job of making us think about where answers might lie to these bigger questions of life. One professor of economics in Copenhagen has been researching the relationship between coronavirus and faith. Her study is titled "In Crisis, We Pray: Religiosity and the COVID-19 Pandemic." And this is what she says. She says, we humans have a tendency to use religion to cope with crises. The COVID-19 has proven no exception. The rise in prayer intensity supersedes what the world has seen for years. What Corona does is find a new way to remind us that there's something very wrong with our world, a world in which loved ones are taken away from us. Matthew Paris wrote in the Times newspaper after the death of his father, "I've decided I don't want to come to terms with Dad's death. It's awful that he isn't here. It still cuts me up, and this is a fact of love." Welsh poet Dylan Thomas asked that we do not go gentle into that good night, but rage against the dying of the light. And the Bible insists that our instincts are right. Death doesn't belong in God's good world. And actually, death only entered the world when human beings turned our backs on God, pushed him away, that we might make up the rules for life ourselves. A friend told me of an interview he'd heard on the radio in which a dad told a very moving story of how his son had gone into hard drugs. And as is so often the case, to keep the habit going, his son started to steal from everyone else in the family. Things got so bad that he even became violent at home, and to make matters worse, he was in complete denial. So finally, they had no other choice but to change all the locks, the doors of the house, put security locks on the windows so he couldn't break in, and they made him live in the garage. And the dad said in the radio interview, it was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. But he needed to know that if he wouldn't treat us properly, then he couldn't be part of our family home. What the father did was to protect his family, but also to try and win back his son. And God has put us under a sentence. As we heard from C.S. Lewis, the sentence of death. God said to Adam those words which we often hear at the side of a grave, "From death you came, and to death you shall return." And just like that father to his son, so God says to deeply troubled and a rebellious world, you can't live for rebels forever. You can't live as rebels forever. I guess it doesn't bear thinking about, does it? A world in which Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler could live forever. So the coronavirus pandemic, well, it is a total tragedy. My own parents live in a residential community where the first cases have just been confirmed. They're in their 80s. It's just scary. I can't and don't claim to fully understand to know what God is doing in all of this, but I do know that this virus is designed to push us back towards God. C.S. Lewis again said, pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pains. It's his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. God is speaking to us through our pain. And that professor from Denmark has shared the evidence that maybe we're responding. And that's why I think the Easter story comes to us with a freshness and a power and a relevance for today. See, what we discover in the Easter story is that we too have heard hoofbeats, in the early morning, and then the announcement that came in our reading from John's Gospel that tells of a great battle that has been won against our greatest enemy, death itself. For that first Easter Sunday, for the first time in human history, death lost a battle. A dead body was placed in a grave, but it returned to life, never to die again. And you know, that is the good news this Easter Sunday, or any Easter Sunday. It's the announcement that has power to change our story and our lives. If it's true, it's life-changing news. It's the news we've been waiting for, a vaccine for death. We didn't do anything to achieve it, but we share in what God has done. A friend of mine is a vicar, and he takes a fair few funerals where he serves in the parish. And one mourner said to him recently, "I'd like to believe there's something beyond death, but no one has come back to tell us, have they?" And my friend had to gently point out, actually there is, and his name is Jesus. Jesus gave up his life to a Roman cross. That's what we remember on Good Friday, to pay the penalty for our sin. But he always knew it wasn't the end of the story. No, Jesus said to his followers before his death, "No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again." And so you see, Jesus didn't merely cheat death. He defeated death. And that is the good news to end all good news. And this same Jesus who took up his life holds out a lasting hope to us in our crisis. For Jesus also says, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die." And so the question on Easter Sunday has to be, is this a story we can actually believe? Well, certainly, down the centuries, some people have questioned it, and sure, it's not an easy thing to believe, and yet there are stories around the world of many, countless numbers of people who've doubted at first, but have come to believe that it's true. I want us to turn briefly back to that passage that we had read, to the Easter story, and to look at the two reasons that we can have to be sure that this good news is good news for us, that this vaccine for death actually works. And the first piece that we see of evidence in this story that we had read is the empty tomb. See, the heart of the Easter Day story is that the tomb in which they buried Jesus' body on Good Friday was empty on Easter Sunday. And you know, to this day, no one has ever claimed to have taken the body, and no one has ever claimed to have discovered the body. And I think it's helpful to see how the text, that passage, goes out of its way to highlight that the disciples didn't exactly jump to the conclusion that Jesus had been raised to the dead. In fact, they come to exactly the same kind of conclusions that you and I would do in their situation. See, Mary goes to visit the tomb, and she sees the giant stone that covered the entranceway rolled away. And she runs to the disciples, Peter and John, and says exactly what you and I would say. They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. See, the only ones who could have removed a body from a guarded tomb were the Roman authorities. But what is odd is that the only ones who could have removed the body never would have chosen to do so. They wanted to silence this rebellion, put an end to the talk about Jesus, and a missing body, well, that would have only fed any fantasies out there that Jesus was alive. So what was going on? Well, there are clues in our story because the tomb wasn't quite empty. When Peter and John hear Mary's report, they also run to the tomb. And when they do, they don't find a body, but they do find the grave clothes. Strips of linen from Jesus' body and the cloth that had been around his head. And these lay exactly where Jesus' body had been placed. John, the disciple Jesus loved, we're told, verse 8, saw and believed. He started to believe the good news that this was a miracle. But it's not just the empty cave that gives us reason to believe. See, there is an empty tomb, but secondly and importantly, Jesus also appears to Mary and then the disciples. See, if you only had one of those things and not the other, it would lead to serious questions. If you only had an empty tomb, but no one ever really knew or heard from Jesus again, or if you had resurrection appearances, but people discovered the body, well, both options would sort of cancel each other out. What you need is both an empty tomb and the risen Jesus Christ. And so Jesus appearing to Mary and then the disciples is vitally important. The disciples saw Jesus alive again. So you remember in the story that angels appeared to Mary, and she's still sticking to her version, which is they have taken him away, is what she says to the angels. She turns to speak to the one that she thinks is the gardener. And for the third time, she says, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where." This is a woman in no mood to make up crazy stories. But then Jesus speaks to her, Mary. And in that moment, her life changed forever. She ran to the disciples and she says, "I have seen the Lord." And over the next 40 days, when you read through the New Testament, we discover that Jesus appeared on many occasions to his disciples, sometimes one at a time, sometimes to larger numbers. In fact, over 500 on one occasion. So what do we know from history about Jesus? We know that Jesus died on a cross, that he was buried, that the tomb was empty, and that Jesus' disciples claimed to have that he had appeared to them, and not just one, not just even 12, but over 500 disciples or followers of Jesus Christ. So it seems to me that we have good reason to believe in an even greater hope this Easter time. Maybe you're someone who feels that you still have a lot of unanswered questions about Christianity. Well, you're in good company. Lee Strobel graduated from Yale Law School. He became the legal editor at the Chicago Tribune newspaper. His wife became a Christian. He was an atheist and he had a lot of questions and thinking to do. So for 2 years, he used his legal training to investigate the claims for Christianity. And you can watch a 45-minute talk where he sets out the case for Christianity and what persuaded him that Christianity was true. And you can just click on that link that appears now on the screen. He describes how the evidence for the resurrection led him to the conclusion that this was and is the best news that we could hear this Easter time. Ed O'Brien is a member of the band Radiohead, and in The Guardian this past week he said, "If you look at history, it's calamities that awaken us to what's important." He says who's going to win the Premier League is no longer an issue. And maybe those sentiments resonate with you on this Easter Sunday. Where do we find hope in the midst of our crisis? Is it in hoping that we can get through the lockdown and our loved ones get through it unscathed? Is it hoping you can get hold of a vaccine and quickly, hoping you'll have a job to go back to at the end of it all? Well, what about taking hold of a hope that is bigger still? The good news that gives you not just a future now, but an eternal future. For the Jesus who defeated death for us says, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Thank you for listening. And if we can be of help to you, well, click on a link either on YouTube or on Facebook, or just send us an email through the City Church website. And we'd love to do all that we can to help you as you consider these all-important questions. A very happy Easter to you.